Uh, Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming, and I think you'll find this to be a provocative and interesting session. I hope you have lots of questions for this group of panelists. I'm Jim Hoecker. I'm Executive Director of WIRES. For your information, WIRES is a international trade group that promotes investment in the electric transmission grid, both here and in Canada. We are made up by companies from all sectors of the electric business, and we are delighted to put on WIRES University sessions. This is, I think, probably number 15 or 16 in the last few years. So thank you all for being here. Today's subject is the electric transmission grid and national security. I want to thank Senator Lisa Murkowski and her staff for helping us secure these fine quarters, and the professional staff of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee were extremely helpful. So we'll hopefully have 4 presentations this morning, short remarks, and then time for Q&A. So I hope you're able to stay and quiz this group. The electric grid, and transmission in particular, is a major infrastructure asset for the United States. It's probably the most important thing you never think about. I'm always amused when all the enthusiasm around infrastructure investment focuses almost exclusively on roads and bridges. Well, there's no more critical infrastructure than the grid. And I think that'll come through this morning. One reason it's so critical is it is an important component of our national security. We could describe that as this session as security of the grid, or the grid's contribution to national security. And in an era of tremendous change in the industry, and the sources of fuel for electric generation, and climate change and cyber threats and so forth. The grid is increasingly the subject of discussion in the security context. We certainly need to improve its ability to respond with new technologies, better strategies, recognizing the codependence of energy and communications, and certainly going to hear a lot this morning about defense logistics and intelligence. So why is this an important session? Well, it couldn't be more important to talk about the convergence of this domestic network infrastructure and our ability to weather some of the challenges of the 21st century. This morning, I am delighted to introduce 4 really terrific panelists. We have done this show before, and we could take it on the road. It's that good, but you don't want to listen to me. You want to listen to them. Pat Hoffman is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Electricity at DOE. She's had, I think if you put her titles end to end, they probably go from here to H Street or something. It would be, she's had many jobs over at DOE, including acting Undersecretary for Science and Energy. She's an engineer from Penn State, and I'm always delighted to be able to talk to Pat. Paul Stockton, Dr. Paul Stockton is Managing Director of Sonecon, which is a security and economic advisory firm in D.C., and his background is DOD focused. He's responsible for defense critical infrastructure, and led to the creation of the department's first ever mission assurance strategy. And I could, hopefully you've got all these bios, but it takes a while to read through them, and I won't duplicate what you have in your hands. John Conger is an independent consultant president of Conger Strategies and Solutions. He's also director of the Center for Climate and Security and on the advisory board of CISA. John has also presented his ideas at previous WIRES meetings, and his background is at DOD also, where he was Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense from 2015 to 17. Again, his distinguished bio is in your materials. And last, we have from the administration, Brian Harrell. Brian was appointed by the President in November of last year to serve as the 6th Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection at Homeland Security. And he's since expanded his responsibilities as the Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security within what's CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. That's a mouthful. All these folks have tremendous pedigrees and a lot of great things to say. So I will now turn it over to Pat, and we'll just work our way down the line here. Thank you very much for being here, and think of some good, tricky questions to ask these folks.
I can't wait for the discussion. I'll keep my comments short. But first of all, I'd like to thank Jim Hoecker and the WIRES group for hosting this meeting. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists. This is truly a great set of panelists for the discussion and an important discussion. And I'd also like to thank Senator Murkowski and the staff for hosting and facilitating this discussion as well. So my name is Pat Hoffman. I work for the Office of Electricity in the U.S. Department of Energy. Our mission and what we go after is really long-term, game-changing solutions for the electric sector. We really want to think about the investments in the future that will help mitigate some of the risks that the sector is facing. What I'd like to do is actually have 4 points to focus on today. Really first talk about the importance of the electric sector, but then really hit some points around the sea changes that we're experiencing, the sea changes to watch out for, and then things that I think we really should engineer and really focus on. How do we drive some investments moving forward? So first of all, a little bit about the electric sector. A very complicated system of systems. I usually challenge DOD that the electric sector is a little more complicated than they are from a systems perspective. But we have over 3,300 utilities that are comprised of investor-owned utilities, municipals, and co-op utilities. We have what is called the Big 200, which are the 200 utilities that really serve the majority of the customers in the United States. When you think of city centers and so on, we have over 450,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines, 2.5 million miles of distribution lines, and over 45,000 substations in the United States. When we talk about demand, you think of electricity services. 38% of the electricity goes to residential customers, 36% to commercial customers, and 25% to industrial customers. So what does that really tell you? It's a huge asset, a valuable asset in the United States that serves just about every part of our economy, from industrial to residential to commercial. It supports our military installations. It supports a lot of other critical functions. And as we get forward in the conversation, we could talk about some of the dependencies and interdependencies we're facing. But it is a complex system of systems. So now let's really go through some of the brief comments on what changes we are experiencing right now. The next generation capacity from EIA in 2020 will come from renewables, wind and solar and natural gas. The short-term energy outlook looks at our next generation, from our generation perspective, 37% from natural gas, 22.6% from coal, and 13% from renewables. Other things to make note of is retirements are going to come from coal, nuclear, and older natural gas units. One thing to note from a state perspective is some of the policy changes and policy statements that states are making. 6 states in the United States have 100% renewable targets, 8 additional states are considering increasing to a higher percentage of renewable targets. As we look forward to some of the changes that the states are experiencing, if you're not familiar with the California duck curve, I suggest you look up the California duck curve on the internet. But basically what it's showing is a great ramping need in California in the middle of the day to compensate for the change in generation when solar is not available and other generation has to come in and spin up towards the evening hours. But what we're heading towards is a just-in-time delivery. In the electric sector, the concern is how are we going to have flexibility and capacity to meet any sort of what I would say out of normal behavior. So if an event occurs on the system, can we spin up enough generation resources fast enough to meet the needs and the demands of customers? So as we talk about just in time, any sort of volatility or any sort of change from a normal behavior can become a crisis, whether you're talking an increase in price of electricity or a crisis from a generation capacity point of view. And so we must think about this and plan for this moving forward. So what do we need to watch out for? As I look at what changes that we need to think about is, of course, the increasing risk and threats. The ODNI report from February 2019 really highlights the capacity and capability of foreign actors to really target the electric and natural gas system. Specifically, it states Russia and China in the ODNI report. Please take a look at that, but that is a significant risk that we are facing. As we look at it, and the other panelists will talk about cyber events that are continuing to occur in the United States writ large. We must watch out for that. As we look at investment, we want to continue to make sure that we realize that hurricanes is one of the ongoing real-time events, whether you look at Puerto Rico, whether you look at Dorian, that the United States faces on a regular basis, and we must continue to invest to mitigate some of the risk of these events. I would also say that something to watch out for as part of this conversation is increasing dependencies and interdependencies. As we get increasingly dependent on natural gas, the U.S. electric infrastructure must truly understand the impacts of any sort of natural gas interruption to the electric sector. And some of the ISOs and RTOs are actively investigating their dependence on natural gas. But as you look at other dependencies and interdependencies, I really think of telecom, I think of water, and I think of natural gas. And some of that DHS has defined as lifeline sectors in the United States, and they've looked at it as critical functions for the United States. So these are really important as we move forward to think about that from our investment point of view, but also really to make sure that we understand the interdependencies and the effects of some of those systems on the electric system. So that is what the Department of Energy's focus really is we concentrate on the electric system, but we also think about how other sectors will affect the operations of this system. Unlike DHS that's looking at the 16 critical infrastructure sectors writ large, we are solely focused on how does this impact the operations, the reliability, and the security of the electric sector. So where do we need to engineer? Where do we need to focus on moving forward? Some of the things that I wanted you to think about as we move forward, and we can have more discussion as part of the discussion time period, is really how do we invest in resilience? What does resilience mean? How do we drive resilience? In my mind, it's additional capacity on the system, but it's also the ability to recover quickly in an emergency situation. So those are the two prongs of resilience, and from my perspective. So it's being able to bring supplies to rebuild quickly, but it's also the ability to have spare capacity. But how do we really continue to drive some of those arguments? The second area is really AI and machine learning. What we are trying to do is really think about how do we put advanced sensors in the system, how do we really gain additional information and knowledge which can lead to better decision making. What we want to do is be forward-leaning. So we want to look for leading indicators as part of the electric sector to really say, How can we identify problems as they are developing versus what the electric sector traditionally does is look backwards. And they say, okay, this event has occurred. You can look at the analysis of the 2003 blackout and say, this event has occurred. Let's figure out the forensics around this. We want to be able to accelerate the forensics time frame, but also be able to advance and be forward-leaning. Usually, the one thing that I state is a lot of people don't realize when we did the 2003 blackout, it took close to a year to analyze the information and the data from that blackout. When NERC looked at the 2011 outage, it took less than a day, approximately a day, to look at the data and analysis. That is how we are getting into the information age, and we have to really think about how do we structure the value of data and information in the electric sector moving forward. Energy storage, another area that we need to engineer the potential futures of. We've thought about this for 10 years and looking how energy storage could be valued in the marketplace. I'm at a point that we have to recognize energy storage as a system asset and really get energy storage on the system. We need storage for the flexibility with respect to the California system. You look at what the California mandates are. You look at some of the other energy storage mandates out there. How do we really continue to develop energy storage as a system asset? The ability to do national level modeling is another area. So within the Department of Energy, we're looking at the North American Energy Resilience Modeling. The strategic plan is outside on the front desk, but it's the ability to do scenario analysis. And what we want to do is be able to look at some of the dependencies and interdependencies to take a hard look at some scenarios and think about what investments would be required in resilience as we move forward in the United States. We want to take a look at it from a national level. Some of the ISOs and RTOs are already building off of this and looking at some of the interdependency levels at a regional level. The issue is that we have to take it's a connected system, so we have to take a holistic approach as we move forward and looking at scenarios, but building the capacity to understand dependencies and interdependencies. And the last area that we really need to focus on from an investment point of view, but also from a policy structural point of view, is supply chain issues. Whether it's from a cybersecurity perspective, a supply chain management point of view, we really need to take a hard look at how do we think about our supply chain, the availability of supplies, the access to supplies, and the security of supplies. And so with that, I am going to stop with, hopefully that was concise with my 10 to 15 minutes of comments, and then look forward to the discussion.
Well,
Jim, thanks to you and WIRES for all you do to strengthen national security. I'm enormously grateful. You get no credit for that publicly, but let me just acknowledge it here. Let me also acknowledge the presence of Wayne Jones, a former colleague from the Pentagon who's now National Security Advisor for Senator Rob Portman, and again, understands the critical importance of energy resilience to national security. I'd like to say a few words about the emerging threat that Pat referenced, both in terms of direct threats to transmission systems and other components of the electricity subsector, but also the indirect threat posed by China and other potential adversaries to disrupt grid reliability, not by attacking grid infrastructure itself, but going after natural gas infrastructure in order to cut off the supply of fuel on which power generation and grid reliability depend. Well, why would they do this? Well, starting with the bulk power system has mandatory cybersecurity standards and physical security standards that the gas system lacks. Secondly, if you want to figure out how to harden critical electric infrastructure, you have a design basis threat. You have an agreed upon way of characterizing how severe that threat is going to be, and therefore what kinds of defenses are you going to need. So you can answer the question, resilient against what? You know what the threat's going to look like, so you can size and structure your defensive measures accordingly. Nothing like that exists in the natural gas sector, equivalent to that which currently benefits nuclear power generation and physical security of critical electric infrastructure, substations, and what have you. So we've got a severe threat, and thank you for referencing Pat ODNI's statement that China has the ability to interrupt the flow of gas for weeks. What would that be like in New England, for example? Other regions of the United States that are utterly dependent on the flow of natural gas for power generation. Southern California, where there are critical defense assets in order to deploy forces to fight and win a war in East Asia. We need the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach to be fully up and running. They depend on the flow of electricity. The bad guys know this, right? So let's get serious about what it's going to take for energy sector resilience. Now let me offer some praise. First of all, Pat, to you and the DOE team for everything you're doing to more effectively model energy sector resilience through your NARM initiative, which I hope we can talk about later. And for the first time, examine these interdependencies, look into the future as fuel supplies shift, and then begin to think, okay, what are the gaps in resilience that we need to fill? And then, Ryan, let me congratulate you on the progress that you and CISA and DHS as a whole are making, including important steps being taken by TSA now, which is responsible for the security of the natural gas system. But the truth is, TSA doesn't have a lot of cyber expertise on its own. They're relying on the larger DHS team, which you are a critical component of, in order to help them do their job to advance the dime. And advance the dime, I would hope, in a couple of ways. First of all, let's get a design basis threat established for the natural gas system, equivalent to that which we had, Wayne, as you remember, for physical security of DoD installations. Let's agree, hey, this is the scale of the threat that we've got to be ready to handle, so we can assess, resilient against what. If you don't have a design basis threat, you're in the swamp. Then secondly, I think we need to continue to press what, Pat, you mentioned, and that is the multi-sector dimensions of national security. I've been focusing thus far on gas and electric interdependencies, but as you briefly mentioned with regards to telecom and so much more, water sector, all the things with which, Brian, you're so familiar, we need this larger modeling effort and understanding of interdependencies, and then figure out what are investments in transmission going to be needed in order to deal with this context of complex interdependencies and risk of cascading failures, because I don't believe we have sufficient investment in transmission going forward, given the multiple nodes of failure the adversaries will try to seek to exploit. And then finally, I love FERC. I hope they get reinvigorated on their effort, which is currently maybe not making sufficient progress to deal with these resilience challenges. They got off to a great start. I hope that progress will continue, because nothing's more important to national security than continuing to strengthen the resilience of the power grid and the components on which the grid depends to function. So thank you very much. And Jim, again, thanks very much for allowing me to appear with such distinguished people, including my old battle buddy, John Conger.
Yes, I'm next. All right, well, good morning. So yeah, Paul and I used to work together at DoD. Paul had the big picture job, and I was in charge of all the installations and bases. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the customers, and from a national security perspective, why is the grid important and electricity important to those bases? I think before we get into a lot of the details, I want you to think about that. More and more at DoD operations is being run back here in the U.S. these days. UAVs are being flown from Nevada. You have computer systems that are, processing intelligence back here that they're going to use in the field. There's a lot of critical activities going on here that depends on that electricity, and so operations can be interrupted in more ways than one of which is interruption of the electricity supply. So I think that from a very basic perspective, there is not this sort of indirect threat from taking down the grid, or a civilian threat from taking down the grid, which all is true, but also a direct threat to military operations and a direct impact to military operations from an interruption in electricity. And it's not just, shutting it off, it's the quality of electricity too. So if you have fluctuations, or the quality of the power is wrong, it can mess up your electronic systems. And so in that context, we care about the quality of the electricity that's coming into our bases too. Now, DoD used to run all their own electric systems, and there was a lot more power generated on base than there is now. But it's cost ineffective to do that, and we depend on a lot of stuff outside the fence line. There are, Pat was talking about interdependencies, and there are huge numbers of interdependencies. We talk about resilience. If you can make the base resilient, but the community and the civilian infrastructure outside the base are not resilient, you're still screwed. Because think about it, the base depends on stuff outside the fence line for electricity, for natural gas, sure, for water, for wastewater. What happens when the toilets don't flush? There are transportation nodes, communications nodes. All the civilian employees come from off base. So what happens when something happens and you can't get the civilians on base? What happens when you can't get the military folks on base? Because 2/3 of them have their housing off base. There are a whole host of things that can be used to interrupt, and that can be electricity provided off base that interrupts, say, a key water system. That all of a sudden you don't have water on the base. So it's not a one-dimensional problem, and it's probably more than three-dimensional chess that we're dealing with here. This is a lot of interdependencies between the base and off the base. And the threats come from multiple vectors. There's cyber threats. I mean, we all talk, and when Paul's talking about the Chinese and what they're going to be messing around with, we're largely talking about cyber threats, although there are physical threats as well. There were examples of, physical attacks and bullets being shot into substations, by unknown entities some years ago. And I'm sure that there are still other things that I am currently not briefed into that are going on today. I spend a lot of time on natural threats these days. And if you want to talk about what has negatively impacted DoD readiness and DoD operations more than anything else in the last several years, it's when somebody throws a hurricane at us. And you can, look at the panhandle of Florida, and we lost Tyndall Air Force Base, and a large number of our F-22s were damaged from Hurricane Michael just a year ago. Camp Lejeune got huge $3.5 billion worth of damage done to it from Hurricane Florence. We lost a third of Offutt Air Force Base, where Strategic Command is, from record flooding in the Midwest. So natural threats are real, and they are happening, and again, you have impacts to the electric grid from that. During my tenure at DoD and overseeing all of our bases and such, there were two of the 6 years that I was doing that. There were 2 examples where we lost power at a base for 3 weeks. So those are real examples. Those are not prospective threats. Those are evident. This happened. One was during the Fukushima incident. We lost power to Misawa Air Base in Japan for 3 weeks, and the other one was during Superstorm Sandy. The recovery of Naval Weapons Station Earl on the New Jersey coast took 3 weeks. Tyndall, I think, lost it for more than that. It was, based on what I've been told, they lost power for a month. So when you start hearing these actual examples, you start thinking about what is the customer going to plan for as far as a likely occurrence. Because if you had 2 examples of 3 weeks in a 6-year time span, I think any base is going to have to plan for some regularity of this could happen to me, especially if you're in a hurricane zone. But not necessarily, because Offutt's in the middle of Nebraska, and they had impacts there. So what is DoD doing about all of this? Well, there's only so much it can do off base, right? I still remember the visit from the folks from Nebraska saying we need to increase our levies and this will affect Offutt Air Force Base, but I had no legal authority to spend money off the base. If I don't own the property, I can't spend money on your levies no matter how nicely you ask. And, you know, that left us more vulnerable. You know, if the grid is vulnerable, should DOD spend money on it? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, but we don't have the authority to do that quite. There was a new program that Congress created called the Defense Community Infrastructure Program. I think that's mostly focused on municipalities rather than commercial infrastructure. But nonetheless, you're starting to think about how can we are so dependent on stuff outside the base that we have to start thinking about, well, you know, if that's our weak link, maybe we should throw money at that problem. And so, but the problem is so big, right? I mean, we have about $1 trillion worth of infrastructure at DOD across 500 bases and a lot of different pieces and types of buildings. I would hazard to guess that the electric transmission infrastructure is more expensive than that in real property value. And certainly upgrades would cost more than that. So we just don't have the money. So what is DOD doing? DOD is focusing on sort of planning, what happens when the power goes out, what do we do, analysis. They're doing exercises. They're doing exercises where, and they've done this probably close to 10 times now, where they go into a base and shut off the power, see if all their backup generators work, shut the whole thing down, pull the plug. And they found not all the generators work. Especially, you know, when you're not just flipping it on and flipping it off to see if it works, but rather, you know, hooking it into the power load and seeing if the generator can handle it. The first example they did, they were down at Fort Stewart. They pulled the plug, and out of 95 generators, 91 worked. So who's going to guess which 4 aren't going to work on your base, right? One of them was the hospital. Oops. They had to turn the power back on to the hospital. But it reflects the assumption that DOD is making, which is that they assume the grid's not going to be there for them. They're assuming that there will be a crisis and the grid's not going to be there for them. And so they have to be resilient to that problem. So they're doing these interdependency analyses. They're doing these studies. They're working with DHS and DOE to do some of that stuff. I know that the Idaho National Lab set up a resilience optimization center that's focused a little bit less on the grid and a little bit more on the customers and how to make the customers more resilient in that context. And so those relationships matter, and those projects matter. But mostly what DOD is trying to do is use other people's money. That is DOD, people always laugh at me. I was the deputy comptroller of the Defense Department for a little while. And I can tell you, DOD doesn't have enough money. They don't. It's a lot of money, but they're being asked to do more things than that amount of money. And so you underfund things, you take risk in that budget, and you don't fund your infrastructure. Let's talk a little bit about electric infrastructure on a DoD base. It sucks, to put it nicely. When DoD is forced to maintain its own infrastructure, if it's not broken, they don't fix it. It's not built to standard. And we have the utilities privatization program where utilities will come in and take over the electric infrastructure on a DoD base and charge for taking care of it. And uniformly, they find that there is so much work to do to repair it. I mean, they get paid for it, but DoD has to make it a must-pay bill in order to make it paid for. Otherwise, they're just not going to do it. And so you find stuff that's hazardous, and you don't have people on those bases who know how to maintain the electric infrastructure on your base. And so when utilities come in, they have a lot of work to do. But that. I won't say that incompetence. I'll say that lack of skills present on a base. It makes it very difficult to do some of these more sophisticated sort of solution sets. So microgrids are a great idea. They're a wonderful idea for resilience on a DoD base. And who's going to maintain them? So, the problem set then becomes there aren't the PhDs on the base. And especially if you expect that microgrid to do something like demand response or peak shaving or these more sophisticated things, you don't have the PhDs available on these bases, which are largely remote, to be able to manage this stuff. And so, we have examples of microgrid pilots that we've done that they're basically just rocks now. They are useless. They have not been maintained, and they're no longer providing utility. And so in that context, you have to be thinking about the future maintenance of a system if you're going to make an investment. And so, if a utility is going to take over power on a base, then the utility will probably have the sophistication and the capability to be able to manage it. But if the DoD is going to do it itself, then that's a problem. So what else can other people pay for? Renewables on site, that affects the grid. Well, renewables on site is one of those things where somebody will come in, and we had a bunch of these things going on, not just in the last administration, but in this one as well, where people would come in and they'd say, okay, I'm going to spend all the money to build your new solar farm. I'm going to, charge you less than you're currently paying now. On some power purchase agreement. You just have to sign up to a long-term power purchase agreement, which DoD has the authority to do. So we do these 30-year power purchase agreements. We pay less money, and we didn't pay anything up front. That's good, and hard to argue with. But that means that there are more renewables on site on DoD bases, and that affects the grid, and it affects the stability of the grid. And so that means storage is much more important, which a lot of these things went straight out to the grid and weren't built for resilience. They were built for saving money. So those are augmentations that once you build in the resilience and you build in the ability to shunt the power back to the base, if the grid goes down, then you lose your savings because it's more expensive that way. So those are all things to think through as we think about what is DoD going to do? How do they monetize the resilience? How do they get somebody else to pay for it? I'll leave you with one last example before we hand off. So the Navy of the services, the Navy is particularly analytical, I would say, and they do a very good job of coming up with numbers and doing in-depth analysis and turning things into models and spreadsheets and such. And they did a resilience analysis of their energy infrastructure and came up with more than 700 gaps, problems, things that could go wrong in their infrastructure, in their electric infrastructure that were to critical missions that were the highest priority. And they said, we've got to fund the filling of these gaps. And so, based on this crisis and based on this urgency, they have managed to come up with enough money to fund 17 of those 700 this year. So, as we think about how much money is available and how one can actually address some of these problems, there's stuff here that's going to, not all of them are things that they can pay for, right? Some of it's off base. There was an example of a substation that outside Norfolk that is below flood level. And so you assume that in a hurricane or with enough years of sea level rise, is just, going to fail to operate. And something's going to have to happen. But the Navy, it doesn't have the money, and neither do the other services, to fix all their problems. And so they're going to have to rely on you guys to pay for everything. And I mean you guys in the sense of both industry and Congress. To be able to deal with these problems, because the problems are real, the problems are there. We rely on the grid, but we do also assume that it's going to fail. So I'm going to leave it at that high note.
Thanks, John. Right?
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, rather. Pleasure to be here. Jim, thank you so very much. The three rock stars that you have down here are absolutely top shelf. I feel honored to be speaking on the same panel as them. So a little bit about me. I come from industry. One day I'm going to go back to industry. I am not from inside the Beltway. I spent some time at NERC, spent some time leading security at Duke Energy. I recognize that the things that happen here inside the Beltway in our glass offices in Arlington or Washington, D.C. have a real impact to industry. And so industry is a part of this solution. Industry needs to have a voice. And I do want to suggest to you that within CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS, we are very focused on reducing risk. We are the nation's risk advisors. We are not the risk managers. Managing risk has everything to do with industry. We recognize that private industry owns and operates over 85% of the critical infrastructure, and so it is our job to advise on risks through intelligence, through modeling, through analytics, to talk about how to best mitigate risks throughout this country. I do want to highlight really quick, though, the amount of really significant contributions that the utility industry has made over the last number of years. And I don't want this to get lost in the conversation. We have the NERC CIP standards, critical infrastructure protection standards. We have the design basis threat focused on generation and transmission of electric power for this country. We have the NERC grid security exercise, or GridX, which happens to be going in November. It is the 5th iteration. And so I want to suggest to you that industry isn't simply sitting back on its laurels. It's not rocked back on its heels. It is actually making the investments. It's doing the things that they know that they need to ensure resilience. I'll also add to that just the amount of reliability assessments that come out of NERC every single year, where they're talking about emerging threats. They're talking about what they see on the system in near real time, the things that we really should be focused on in terms of investment and resilience going forward. Some of the major threats that I see to the utility space, I'm getting some echoes, I'm sorry. Some of the threats that I certainly see, in no particular order, is the talent shortcomings that we have within industry, specifically around security, cybersecurity, most specifically. And so right now we have a lot of institutional knowledge within your organizations out in industry that, quite frankly, one day they want to get up and they want to go retire. And once they exit that door goes a lot of, again, that institutional knowledge, that 25 years of being that substation engineer. They know how to operate the system in real time. And so we need to make sure that that information, that knowledge transfer happens to the younger generation. In terms of cybersecurity, government is competing against industry. Industry is competing against academia, and we're all competing against the same amount of finite resources. And so today, we are working with universities to create that pipeline of cybersecurity, national security, physical security professionals to not only come to the government and kind of cut their teeth and understand what the threats are, but then also go back into industry. A rising tide does, in fact, lift all boats. And so I want to ensure that when they see the threats from China, from Russia, from North Korea, from a government perspective, they're able to transfer that out into industry and understand how to best mitigate threats. Insider threat. And I'm trying not to tread on any of the waters that have already been discussed. But right now within our organizations, we have individuals that work for us that have that institutional knowledge as to how to bring us to our knees. They know the keys to the kingdom. They know what the crown jewels are. They know if I don't push that button, maybe nothing happens. But if I push this button, if I pull this lever, if I execute this kind of code, if I go to this server room and do some sort of sabotage, if I target this particular substation in my critical footprint, I could have some significant damage that not only damages the company and our brand, but also the bulk power system. And so, in my opinion, investment in having an insider threat program is worth its weight in gold. Every single penny that you do. Do you know who works for you, number one? Do you know what they're looking at on a daily basis? Are they being radicalized? Are they going to hate sites? Are they trying to probe your system and gain access to things that they shouldn't have access to? Is data leaving your system and going to their Gmail, or going to your competitor, or going to a country overseas? The answer is probably yes, but do you have the technology in place to raise the alarm bells, to pull up the red flags and say, oh my gosh, something is going on here? I don't have all the puzzle pieces. I have a lot of question marks, but now with this little bit of technology information, I'm gonna start asking some very pointed and critical questions about who is doing what on my system. Industrial control systems. Right now, today, we have a lot of legacy ICS, SCADA, OT systems, whatever you want to call them, from the 1980s that are simply not being patched. We have leaned on and benefited from the fact that there is a lot of ignorant individuals, ignorant bad actors out there that aren't necessarily targeting industrial control systems yet. They're quick to go to the DDoS. They're quick to do malware. They're quick to do ransomware. But industrial control systems, we need to focus on updating them, bringing them from a legacy position to something that is updated and that's constantly being monitored and probed, and doing our own penetration testing, our own red teaming to ensure that we're ready for when people do in fact attack our SCADA systems. Somewhat timely, talk a little bit about drones and UAS. unmanned aerial systems. We just saw this last weekend where it has had a significant impact, not only overseas, but here in the United States. In this particular case, it's obviously towards a oil production facility in Saudi Arabia. But today, this is not an emerging threat. This was emerging 5 years ago. This is an imminent threat where we have to protect the overhead threat, the overhead space above our infrastructure. We are quick to recognize that we do not own the airspace above our transmission substations, above our SIP-14 sites, above many of our generation facilities. So what are we doing, and do we understand what is flying above our infrastructure at any point in time? So within the federal government, within the federal space, we are now trying to move this conversation from this echo chamber here in Washington, D.C., to out in industry, to where we are suggesting that we must have detection systems in our critical infrastructure to understand what is flying above them. Let me tell you just a quick little story. A couple years ago, my sons were 10 and 8 respectively. This is somewhat of a fun story. And I gave them a homework assignment. So we're going to go to Toys R Us, and for $100, when there still was a Toys R Us, for $100, we're going to go out and buy this drone. And here's the homework assignment. What I want you to do is figure out how to take this drone to 25 feet up and drop this 6-inch piece of PVC pipe. That's it. That's the homework assignment. A couple weeks goes by because we have school and baseball, and they come running back into the house, and they're, Dad, come take a look. And sure enough, they're smiling from ear to ear, and they come up to about 35 feet, and they drop this 6-inch piece of PVC pipe with this very crude claw contraption and a Bluetooth device, and they do it. They're high-fiving each other. They just came through for Dad, and I'm thinking, my goodness, 8 and 10 years old, about $104, and they drop a 6-inch pipe bomb filled with C4, rocks, glass, nails, screws, into a soft target, into a stadium, into a SIP-14 transmission substation. So this is not emerging, this is already here. And so we as a government need to ensure that we are providing private industry with what they need to mitigate this particular threat. Different bucket, same issue. Industry uses a lot of drones, and they're a great tool for response and recovery. As that storm comes up the coast and causes significant damage, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that are outaged that day on the system, these drones are able to provide some situation awareness, what poles need to go back into the ground, what substations are underwater, these kinds of things. But if you are using and operating a drone made in China, you are potentially introducing and incurring risk into your system. Today, we have seen Chinese manufactured drones that are taking key information from critical infrastructure companies from that system, and data is leaving that system and going overseas. This is not the boogeyman. We have seen it with our own eyes. So what do we do about it? So about 4 months ago, we actually pushed out within CISA an alert to industry on, if you own and operate Chinese manufactured drones, what to do about it, how to mitigate it. If you already own it, what are some of the things that you should do? And I highly recommend looking at other options beyond Chinese manufactured drones. Building a culture of security, and I will kind of relate this back to what some of the panelists have already said, and that is similar to the culture of safety that we created back in the 80s. Many of you who come from industry will recognize that typically before every staff meeting, any kind of a big meeting that happens, what do? It's that 2-minute safety moment, right? Tripping hazards are here, AEDs are up on the wall. If we need to evacuate, don't use the elevators, use the stairs. You be the first one out, I'll be the last one out, you call 911. 2 minutes. Now, what if we also added an additional 1 minute or even 45 seconds, and we said, let's do a security moment as well. And we're now contributing to this culture of security, where we're talking about tailgating, we're talking about piggybacking, we're talking about phishing campaigns, we're talking about that pathway to violence for that coworker that just doesn't seem right. And we're talking about these other major physical and cybersecurity and emergency management issues. We need to move the needle in terms of culture. In the same vein, I think within industry, we have been very focused on compliance risk. Oh my gosh, compliance. Oh my gosh, NERC. Oh my gosh, standards. And I can say that as a former NERC staff person. But we need to move the conversation from compliance risk to a culture of security. Good security will always lead to good compliance. Sometimes vice versa isn't necessarily the case. So as I'm advising executives, many of you are in this room who are in a leadership position, some of the things that I would certainly point to is, I got 5 of them actually, I'll make them really quick. The threat landscape is changing. Today, the Department of Homeland Security that you saw post 9/11 is exactly that, is a post 9/11 anti-terrorism mission, and that mission is changing as we speak. We're gravitating towards domestic terrorism. We're gravitating towards nation-state actors. We are focused on that soft target that people are trying to exploit and use because that strong security apparatus isn't in place. We're focused on investment and resilience into the bulk power system or the electric grid, removing single points of failure, adding redundancy. That is absolutely critical. Understanding your gaps. Having done security for a long time, having been on a battlefield many years ago, one of the questions that I like to ask not only my staff but others is, are you prepared to be overwhelmed when information is incomplete? Intelligence may or may not be there. People are screaming on the radio all at the same time, and maybe there's even blood on the ground. Are you prepared to be overwhelmed? Do exercises. Understand who the right people around the table who need to be there in a time of crisis. Let us not pass around business cards. Let us not build our crisis response plans in the midst of crisis. And defend what matters most. And this is really a risk conversation. Let's defend, or let's protect diamonds like diamonds and pencils like pencils. Understand what are those critical nodes. I'm the first one to tell you, we do not need to protect everything. But what are those crown jewels that we really need to focus on within your systems? Convergence. The convergence between cybersecurity, physical security, operational technology, OT SCADA, and emergency management is here. It is no longer good enough to say, yes, we met with cybersecurity, we meet with them every other Tuesday. Today, we are seeing a blended and a hybrid threat landscape play out before our very eyes. John mentioned a little bit about the Metcalf attack. April 16, 2013, that is a pivotal moment for this particular industry. And it started with a logical piece to it, where they went in and they went into the fiber optic lines, they cut them, cut all the 911 lines as well. So there is a logical, there's a data piece to a physical attack. And there's a number of other scenarios that we can point to as well. Today, we are converged. We cannot operate in these silos of excellence anymore. Everyone needs to be on the same page. Understanding those risks posed by a third party, whether it's a drone, whether it's a laptop, or whether it's your transformer at 345, 500 kV, whatever the case is, understand where those components, those key critical components are coming from. And do you have visibility into those weak spots, into the edges, into the periphery? We need to understand not only what we own and what we operate, but what we are also reliant on. And lastly, information sharing is absolutely critical. We've been talking about this for 15 years. The electricity ISAC, I think, is more robust today than it really has ever been. I'm happy to say that I think they are producing value on almost a daily basis. But information sharing is absolutely critical. Now, I also recognize that sometimes we're inundated with information. We're getting information from all sources. And we need to now do our best to parse out what is critical information, things that are actionable, things that you can actually do something about. Because if everything is critical that day, then nothing is. So understand, again, and it goes back to risk. It goes back to diamonds and diamonds and pencils like pencils, right? Understanding that risk. And lastly, in closing, sorry to occupy all the time here, Jim. Investing in resilience. I cannot do what Pat said justice. She was right on the mark. That's absolutely where we should be gravitating towards. We should operate with the understanding that we will be attacked. We will get hit in the face one day. How do we quickly come back to homeostasis? How do we quickly restore these critical services to the American public? And lastly, I think we do this through collective defense, where it's the federal government, it's private industry, but it's also the American citizen, where we see something, we say something. Where things don't sound right, we alert somebody. We alert the ISAC. We alert the regulators. We alert the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Things are always crystal clear in the rearview mirror. But how can we put some of these puzzle pieces together today to create a better threat landscape to actually do something about it? One more thing. And lastly, for the third time, we're very good at focusing on today's threats. Day in and day out, I do a lot of tactical things that I just cannot get away from because they're important to the agency, they're important to the department, and they need to happen for the American public. But what we also need to do is focus on securing tomorrow. We have a phrase, defend today, which we do a really good job of. But we also need to focus on securing tomorrow. What does infrastructure protection look like in the years 2045 and 2050? When space is a major player, when the bioeconomy is a major player, when all of our devices are connected, society is interconnected. Your cell phone's connected to my cell phone, which might be connected to my coffee pot, which might be connected to a distribution substation. These introduce additional threat vectors. And we need to understand what that enemy avenue of approach is today so that we're sitting around the table and we're building security in from the beginning and we're not bolting it on in the rear. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Well, that all is pretty sobering, isn't it? But I think I'm very encouraged. I love listening to this because I know there are bright people out there who are thinking about the complexities that we're facing, and that's great. We'll take questions from the audience now. Let me just kick it off with one. Paul talked about multidimensional threats and how the electric system, the grid, however you want to describe that, needs to be prepared to meet those threats. Pat had talked about interdependencies. In addition to all the things that we have to worry about, we have a system of gas and electric, water, communications, multiple things. And it's nice to think that that there are people out there that are preparing to address each of these interdependencies, each of these threats. But we have a system, we have a regulatory system that I understand all too well that is multidimensional, just to be kind about it. We have the electric systems regulated by 48 different regulatory commissions, and you can throw FERC in there too, and about a whole bunch of land management agencies and tons of other bodies at various levels of government. How do we get a handle on this? Is this holding us back? Is it retarding our security, our ability to meet these challenges, and to analyze and work on these interdependencies? That's just a question for anybody who wants to opine.
So I do believe we have a complex structure of regulatory oversight in, the electric sector, but you also have just different rules and regulations with respect to siting and permitting of infrastructure. You can just take that as an example. So there's always opportunity. It's how do we really utilize the structure in the system to advance the investments that are required. You look at the need for pipeline infrastructure in New England. Not a lot of pipeline is being built in New England, but yet we're looking at other ways, whether it's transmission infrastructure, dual fuel capability, other things that are being invested in the infrastructure. So from my perspective, it's how do you do analysis and really think about the solution sets that are required from a resilience perspective in each of the different regions, and what tools can you tap to really provide some of the solutions. We have the complexity is there. I mean, from that point of view, it would be nice to simplify it, but we are the infrastructure that we currently have. So how do we really move forward? how do we utilize, ensure, say, the Stafford Act capacity for resilience infrastructure investment can be utilized for hardening, raising substations, to be able to look at resilience in the electric sector, realizing that that underpins the economy and the infrastructure writ large. How do we look at getting organized around the outside defense work that DOE is doing in partnership with DHS and DOD to really look at how do we harden the infrastructure? DOE is looking at specific outside defense site assessments and looking at single point of failures, looking at capacity, looking at opportunities for investment infrastructure. So how do we really take advantage of financing it? I think the biggest question, more so than the regulatory infrastructure, is just how do we finance things moving forward?
So I'm going to answer the question without talking about regulation because that's not. I'm going to answer the question without talking about regulation because it's not my area. But I will say this: when you have a complex system that you're lamenting, that's more complicated than it needs to be. DoD's bureaucracy is like this. And I knew more than a couple people who, wished that things were simpler and sat there and it paralyzed them to try and look at the system and say, oh my God, if only things were simpler. Well, things aren't simpler. You cannot sit down at a chessboard and wish it was checkers because it's more complicated than that. You have to figure out how to play with the system you've got, and you've got to figure out how to win and get your stuff done. It's just the way things are. So yeah, I'm sure the regulatory system is very complicated, and that sucks, but it's probably the system you've got, and you got to figure out how to navigate it and how to get done what you need to get done with the system you're given.
I'll just add that, I'm not necessarily a big regulatory regime program guy, but I will suggest to you that I do think that utilities are more secure today in 2019 than they were back in 2007 at the start of the NERC CIP standards. I do think that a rising tide does lift all boats, and so it does now force everyone to speak from this same lexicon. Everyone is starting from this same foundational piece known as NERC CIP. Now, NERC CIP doesn't touch every utility, obviously, but it touches the majority of the ones, especially on the transmission and generation side. I can speak to you from somebody who owns a regulatory program within DHS, one of the few, known as the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, or CFATS. And I will tell you that when investments in security are being made, everyone is getting better. I'm just a firm believer that as we go forward, though, and we create new standards, especially around cybersecurity, we do need to be very mindful, though, of the fact that we cannot have these standards be so specific and so tailored to certain technologies that the minute that they're written, they're completely outdated. Because this industry, cybersecurity in particular, logical data, is changing rapidly. And so we just need to be very, very mindful that as we craft standards to keep us all secure, that they're still usable a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later. And that takes some real ingenuity. It takes some real thought behind industry. This is not the government. This is not the regulator coming out and say, you shall do this. NERC CIP standards come from industry. The words, the verbiage are used by industry, and they're ultimately approved through the regulator structure. But we do need to ensure that we are leaning on subject matter expertise within industry to create smart standards, especially in this very fluid field.
So since Brian jumped down that path, I'm going to jump in a little bit. I think moving forward, we really need to think about what capacity and capability we want to build in the United States. It's a little bit of a spin from the standards, but really what I'm looking at is, as we analyze whether it's supply chain issues, what capacity, say you could look at the maturity model, the NIST framework from a supply chain point of view, what capacity do we need to build in the United States where supply chain is looking at the same kind of maturity model assessment that everybody else is looking at, and that we have a level of assurance from a supply chain integrity point of view? What capacity do we need to build with respect to information sharing? What capacity do we need to build that allows additional industry monitoring of their own system, so they actually can detect and find vulnerabilities that are occurring on their system. And so as we move forward, I think it really comes down to the capacity that we want to have industry to have from that point of view in either detecting vulnerabilities, you could continuous learning, continuous advancement in the industry. It's similar to like an ISO 9000 type standard. But really, what you're really talking about is the ability to build capacity for detection and understanding.
Questions? Steve?
Oh, yes. So, it's interesting. So we said the word redundancy a few times and words like redundancy. But for the last 20 years, there's been a very strong tide among the economic regulators against redundancy. Not thinking about cybersecurity, but driving down capital costs, driving down O&M costs. The regulators, the interveners, the war against excess capacity. We only need one line if there are 2 or 3 proposals. We should drive down excess capacity throughout the system. So how do you get the word out to the economic regulators, the state legislators, the governor's offices, that whether it's called gold plating or silver plating or just like iron plating, we now have a strong need for more redundancy in a lot of places. That's going to cut against this tide.
So you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's a challenge between just-in-time delivery, market economics, and where we've really thinned out the system to the point where we have to say what is a reasonable amount of extra capacity, whether and storage, we need on the system. And we're very challenged with respect to those principles, because you have the pure economics that are driving. The economics should make the decision, but the economics, you have to accept then that your power is going to go out. You have to accept then that you're going to have to tolerate the extreme volatility of prices. And we play this catch-22 of, well, we want to have cushion and protection against some of these things, but yet we want to operate on market principles. I'm really, where are we going to need, what analysis do we need to optimize the efficiency and effectiveness of our electric system and build in that capacity, engineering the underlying principles for what I would say strong operation and capacity in the electric system, and then figure out how the market can work around those edges. And so I think it has to be a little bit of a balancing of engineering the system from a resilience perspective to how the markets operate on that system.
Let me jump in on that too. So you raised a very important point between capacity and cost, right? Are you willing to pay for more resilience? Are you willing to buy down risk? We saw that in DoD. I'll use a basing example where when you cut back, when you do base closure, you skinny down enough that you take out redundancy in the system and you create fragility and brittleness, right? Use single points of failure, right? But I will tell you this, that as one talks about resilience and as one talks about redundancy, and this is true in DoD, in the federal government, and probably in industry, money always wins. Money always wins. The economics will drive it. And so people aren't going to spend the extra money for the extra safety unless they see dollar signs at the end of that. Now, if it costs a ridiculous amount of money every time you had power failures, well, yeah, they'd build into it, I mean, I'll give you a power system example from my home. I'm a Pepco customer. And after the derecho, some number of years ago, they cut down so many trees. Oh my God, they cut down lots and lots of trees, and we haven't lost power since. So, somebody made an investment and figured out the economics and said, okay, if I do this, I'm going to get the payback. But I tell you what, when you look at the system and you look at how much money is available, money wins.
Yes, sir.
Question for Mr. Conger. So you mentioned that the Defense Department is currently underfunded and there were a lot of deficiencies with the Navy. Okay, so talking about like the Senate NDA and the House NDA, how do you think that kind of works to combat the problem? And then what level do you think the DoD needs funding to be ready?
Wow, what an interesting question. So I can put on my money hat. So the amount that the budget goes to. So I haven't done the complex analysis. I'm not going to give you a top line number. There was a big debate between 733 and $750 billion and ... which were much closer than everybody would make you believe when all is said and done. The 750 had nestled in it some stuff for the border wall and other things like that. So from a DoD perspective, the numbers were much closer together than they would pretend. But that all said, there was an independent analysis by a bipartisan analysis of the National Defense Strategy that came out not long after the National Defense Strategy came out and said, there's not enough money to do all these things. You just have to decide what you're willing to do. We used to prepare for 2 major regional conflicts, and now it's like 1.5 to 1 with the same amount of money. Part of that is people. I know this isn't what we're here to talk about, but I'm going to answer his question anyway. But part of that is people. Half the defense budget is people. Half the defense budget is civilian and military salaries and benefits, not even the contractors. Okay, so it's not the stuff that drives the costs, it's the people. So how big are you going to be, and how many benefits are you going to give them? Does anybody want to roll back benefits for the military? I didn't think so. So that's we're at where we're at, in the defense bills, there's some good energy resilience stuff and there's some good climate resilience stuff, and they put all that in there. And frankly, it's in both bills. Frankly, it was in the last Congress too. The Republican Congresses did a lot of climate resilience stuff, even though they didn't talk about it all that much. It was practical, it was pragmatic, it was stuff the military wanted, and it was stuff that they put in the bills. And now you find the House and the Senate, even though they're different parties, are doing the same things. And it's all sort of going to work itself out. It's not that different. And people are being practical and pragmatic, but it can't cost a lot of money in order for them to do it.
Paul, I was intrigued by your comment about my old agency, FERC. You mentioned that maybe they're not doing such a good job or as good as they could be doing in reliability or promoting resilience, and that we need to also invest more in the grid and the transmission system. For a lot of the reasons that Steve Mitnick mentioned, we have now 10 to 15 years to plan and build a transmission facility, and we're kind of stuck with that, which makes the system incredibly not nimble, and potentially creates a security problem, if I interpret you right. So is there something further, some advice you'd give to Chairman Chatterjee over there?
You bet. If I could be so bold. First of all, I think the process that FERC launched of going to RTOs and ISOs to get input was very, very sensible. Starting with, how do you define resilience? Let's get a consensus there. And I think some of the responses that the RTOs and ISOs have provide a terrific basis for further progress. So PJM, for example, said we need to understand, again, the question of resilient against what? What is the threat for which we ought to be prepared? We need to understand how much to invest against an understanding of the scale and scope of the threat. I love that. And PJM, of course, is going down the path of doing this resilience analysis. I think this is a model to be followed on a nationwide basis. Let's get agreement, which will vary region to region, on what's the foundation for conducting analysis. Secondly, the New England ISO's response, I thought again was terrific, because they went to a question that you raised here, and that is how much redundant capacity exists, above all, for resupply of dual fuels, resupply of the diesel fuels that we're going to need to keep generators going if natural gas supplies are cut off. This is the ultimate hedge. This is the guarantor of resilience if the you-know-what really hits the fan. If we don't have gas for generation, at least we'll be able to burn diesel fuel. But you know what? Due to regulatory constraints, you can't store very much diesel fuel on site. You got to rely on folks to resupply you. Nobody knows, I would submit, how far down we've been skinnying our distribution, our refinement and distribution capabilities to truck in massive amounts of diesel fuel all over to provide for generation in a disrupted environment where cyber attacks are crippling communications. I mean, it's going to be a mess if we have to do large-scale diesel fuel resupply. And your point is so smart that we've been skinnying down excess capacity. I'd apply it especially to ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel industry where nobody knows how bad it is. And the New England ISO report called it, Jim, the X factor. No one knows. And this is double plus ungood, to use a technical phrase. And there are many examples, many of which, Brian, you've been making terrific progress and the NRMC in identifying these complex interdependencies and advancing the dime in your infrastructure protection portfolio. Thank you so much for the progress you're making.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Jeremiah Leonard. Thank you so much for coming in. This is great. One of my questions is regarding nuclear energy. We've got about 100 plants roundabout, and about half of those are slated to be shut down in the next decade, my understanding. So how are we preparing for that infrastructure-wise, supply-wise? We've all talked about demand, it's increasing.
I'll lead off on this one. It goes exactly to your previous question. What are the attributes of resilience and how much are we willing to pay for energy resilience? So nuclear power plants have the fuel stored on site. They have strong physical security. They've been going the extra mile for cybersecurity. They can't always compete against natural gas on the way that energy is currently priced. Is there a need to have some kind of understanding of the additional value provided by resilience that ought to be built into market functions? Some people say, well, states can continue to subsidize nuclear power generation on a state-by-state basis. Maybe that's okay as a stopgap to deal with the issue that you saw of premature retirements that are very near term. But I think over time we need to have market forces reflect the value of resilience and the contributions of resilient generation to overall grid reliability in a way that serves national security. That's my humble opinion.
Yes, sir.
I want to talk a little bit about response to an event, whether it's a cyber attack or a physical threat or a natural disaster. You've all emphasized how important it is to have like a multi-stakeholder approach involving government, industry, citizens. But I was wondering, what body do you believe should be responsible for taking leadership in terms of coordinating all of these different stakeholders in the event of an emergency when it comes to responding to an incident?
Well, I will defer to the sector-specific agency in this particular case of DOE. They are very focused on this within their new organization known as CISA, and I'm not trying to take anything away from what Pat's about ready to say. But at DHS, we recognize the partnership. The interagency is incredibly important. I think we have a lot of assets and manpower and expertise that they are able to lean on. We're able to lean on them as well. We have a number of analytical tools that really start to focus on the cascading impacts and interdependency issues. If we were to lose a particular substation or a particular nuclear generation facility, what does that mean for the chemical plant down the road? What does it mean for the water facility down the road? And so we have that ability. I think we work well together as a team. But this all comes and smacks us right in the face here in November when we do the NERC grid security exercise, which is an opportunity to sit around the table and kind of go through in the course of about 48 hours, what is that worst case scenario? What are those policy triggers when you have the haves versus the have-nots? And are we giving electricity over here versus over there? I will say that a lot of the policy triggers, and Pat, please, are going to come from and be resolved by private industry. They are a major part of the solution here, and we are simply trying to quarterback, in some instances. But please. Yes.
So just to add on to what Brian said, the industry is the first line of defense. They're going to be the first person, taking action, whatever action is necessary. With respect to your question, I really think we need to have a consistent architectural scheme. We already have the ESF structure with the SSA. It is really trying to figure out how do we apply that across all different types of events, which typically has been utilized from hurricane events because it's been one of the most events that we've really managed. We have gotten to a point where industry is comfortable with the structure, the coordination, the communication, etc. So how do we make sure that we can apply a consistent set of structure across multiple types of events that have occurred? And I think then you got really the SSAs, you got the ESF structure, you got the coordination with industry, the already established, well documented in the electric sector, the coordination call, the sector coordinating council, the public-private partnerships, the strategic decision-making and prioritization that occurs as part of those calls. We have a formal structure where we work with DHS and their infrastructure so they can look across all sectors. We have a formal reporting requirement where we look at the outage numbers, we look at the electric sector impacts so they can actually look at the critical infrastructure impacts. But then the vice versa occurs where they may look at some other critical infrastructure which we have to feed back into the electric sector. So I think it's well defined, crystallizing, what is working well across industry. I think the maturation that has occurred, especially in the electric sector, is phenomenal from where we were, I'd say 5-10 years ago with respect to the amount of information that is exchanging between the industry and the federal government. And so we need to build upon that. We need to keep consistency. I mean, you upend it and create another new structure, you're just going to move backwards. And I think whatever we look at from a structure has to be built on the strong principles that are already occurring, and then figure out how do we build consistency across other events.
Can I jump in just real quick? This is mostly going to be a question. But as you think about it, the scenarios you just described are not all the same. And they are not one-dimensional problems. So you can lose electric power, but how often do you just lose electric power? Or do you have, a hurricane event, or do you have flooding, or do you have other things that are happening that all have to be managed at the same time? So I guess I have two questions. One is for the panel. How does FEMA fit into this conversation? And are there electric grid specific scenarios? So, like for example, in GridX, who's in charge? If you lose the grid, who manages that? But if you have a larger disaster, how do the electric sector folks fit into FEMA?
So we worked with FEMA to develop a power outage annex. And so that clearly articulates with respect to DOE's responsibility in coordinating with industry on the electric sector side. And then FEMA really takes a hard look at all the other interdependency or cascading effects from a power outage event. And they've done different scenarios where they've said, let's take a look at it. DOE, how would you look at your restoration priorities, or how would the utilities look at restoration priorities? But coordination from that perspective really goes to the effectiveness of the restoration process. So how many generators would FEMA and, ESF3 have to, pull into the process in helping with the restoration process versus a timeline for restoration of the electric infrastructure?
There is a revolution underway, a very good one, in FEMA. Stand by for the issuance of the 4th edition of the National Response Framework, and go read Emergency Support Function 14 cross-sector infrastructure and
Everybody
business.
taking notes? You got that down?
And again, all praise to those who helped make this possible. And it tackles this problem very, very directly. There's enormous progress that's going to be underway soon.
Is there anything you would recommend that Congress pay particular attention to, given where we are today? Any suggestions? I think John would probably say more money, but
Fix the pizza in the Dirksen basement. It's inedible.
okay.
I withdraw that remark.
So I always have suggestions for Congress. Broadly, I think more money is good. I think here's the problem with more money as an answer to the question, which isn't it's not the right answer yet. Because you got to know what you're going to spend the money on. If somebody gave a federal agency a big block of money, they'd know some of the stuff to spend it on, and then they'd feel some compulsion to spend the rest of it on whatever they had out laying on the shelf, without necessarily thinking through, oh my God, is this the best thing to do? I mean, planning is important. You have to recognize a problem. You have to put out guidance, because it's always hard to manage a federal agency without telling everybody what to do and assuming that everybody knows what you meant for them to do. DoD is particularly problematic to expect, let's say, a GS-12 at a base level to understand what the Assistant Secretary said last week, when nobody actually communicated that down to the person. They just sort of know this is important and don't know what they're supposed to do. That's why guidance documents are important. So the guidance has to get done by the department. Then you have to do the planning. And usually the planning is not one size fits all. It's different in every place. You've got different dynamics. You've got different substations. You've got different geographies. You've got different vulnerabilities, different dependencies. Everything's different. So you have to do the planning. Then you throw in the money. Now, I will say this, that from a DoD perspective and an energy resilience perspective, they're doing that. And they're doing the exercises, they're doing the planning, they're identifying their problems, and they're getting their lists of things to do so that when the money does come sometime, that they'll know what to spend it on. They're doing that now. And so if they had the money last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they wouldn't have been able to spend it on the right stuff necessarily. They'd spend it on some really good stuff and then some less good stuff. But they're doing the planning now, and I'd say inside of a year or two, they'll have really comprehensive lists of where they'll be able to spend all this money from a resilience perspective.
Great. Well, I would close by saying I think you should pay attention to what's happening at DOE with the National Resilience Modeling Exercise led by Assistant Secretary Hoecker. Paul is a great writer, and he has a lot of stuff that is very illuminating. And DHS is forever busy trying to protect us and prevent threats from being executed on. I'm would like to say that this is videoed. You will find it on the WIRES website, wiresgroup.com, and we'll put our panel's credentials up there too, so you can chase them down and ask them further questions. But thank you very much for being here, and join me in thanking this great panel.